In today's commercial awareness update, I'm going to start talking about the arts and cultural sector in the UK. It's something that we all know quite a lot about. It's something that's continually in the news, and there's been some really interesting developments over the last few months. So I'm just going to look at some of the basics of how the sector runs and some of the impacts of the developments we've seen recently. According to the Centre for Economic and Business Research, the arts and cultural sector is worth £10.8 billion to the economy every year. That's a really, really large part of the economy. Arts organisations have quite an interesting way of funding themselves. They have a much broader brief than many other businesses. So I'm just going to look at perhaps how they fund themselves to give you a feel for what some of the tensions within what they do might be. So most arts organisations have got three central planks of funding. The first of these is public funds, money that comes from the government, from local government, maybe from the Arts Council. This can be either a quite significant proportion of their income, or in the case of many much more commercial organisations, they don't get any kind of subsidy whatsoever. However, many of the big organisations that we see, the big theatres like the National Theatre or some of the big orchestras or some of the major museums, are relying on a fairly large chunk of public subsidy. The second part of a cultural organisation's income, of course, is the income that it generates itself. In the case of a theatre, that's the money that a person pays to buy a ticket. In the case of an art gallery, it may be free to get into the general exhibition, but they're going to be charging for maybe the big blockbuster temporary exhibitions that perhaps you see at the Tate Gallery or at the National Gallery. The other parts of the self-generated income are pretty varied. You've probably noticed that most museums and theatres have a cafe that's operating quite a lot of the time. Gift shops are very important. And in the case where access for some or all of the offering is free, you will see things like the box for donations dotted around the space. Those are all valid and important parts of the income. Indeed, you might find that some of this feels a little over-commercialised, but this is probably what's keeping the ship afloat, so don't be too offended by it. The third part of the funding, and this can be again a really very significant part of it, is around sponsorship, donations, philanthropic giving, all that sort of side of things. So you might see a major exhibition is sponsored by an organisation. You might see part of a theatre or an art gallery with a part of it named after the trust or other body that has provided a large proportion of the money. You'll also see various efforts by organisations to create sponsorship money, for instance, a naming a seat project, or other wily fundraising opportunities that people are using to try and boost the amount of money coming into their coffers. So all in all, these three general areas are providing the income for an organisation. So just think about what those mean, what the balance between those is, what the compromises between those are. It's also worth mentioning the staffing and the people who work within arts organisations. Arts organisations typically don't pay as well as the red in tooth and claw private sector. So that means that an arts organisation has a difficult balancing act. Clearly it wants to attract top talent, but if it can't pay the very top dollar, it's got to offer something else. And it's very true that lots of talented and gifted people will make the choice to not maximise their earnings because they believe in the cultural sector, that's where they want to be, that's something they enjoy doing. That creates some tensions when you think about how those organisations might be operating and who staffs them. So let's just look again at those funding areas. In the case of the central funding, government funding, well, we've seen austerity over the last few years. What that means is the overall amount of funding that is being provided has dropped. That can be in a couple of ways. A lot of the central government funding is provided through the Arts Council. Well, the Arts Council currently spends £633 million per year. That's a slight rise in monetary terms on their previous 4 years. However, actually, once you include inflation, that money has dropped. The other double whammy is that some money comes from local government, but of course the central government has been starving the local government of funds as well, and something's got to give there. So arts organisations might be losing 2 times in that. The other thing, of course, is with central funding, with government funding, there's a political aspect. If an organisation is putting on a cultural output that is particularly displeasing to the central funders, it's quite understandable to think that questions will be asked. Artistic integrity is obviously extremely important, but if you are literally spitting on the hand that's feeding you, there might be consequences. In the third category, grants, sponsorship, philanthropic giving, that's where the big news is. What we've seen over the last sort of year, much before that as well, but really the momentum seems to have taken place over the more recent months, is a major questioning of the sources of a lot of the major funds. I'm going to look in particular at two organisations who have fallen badly out of favour with arts organisations. That's the Sackler family, their trust, and BP, British Petroleum. So the Sacklers are massive philanthropists. You'll see Sackler wings, Sackler rooms, Sackler courtyards in the case of the V&A, all around the world. They also contribute to major universities. However, the source of much of the Sackler money comes from Oxycontin, which is an opioid painkiller, which is currently facing massive billion-dollar litigation in the US. The US has a major health crisis around opioid addiction, and Oxycontin is seriously implicated as one of the key drivers of that crisis. That in turn means that the money that is being provided by the various Sackler family foundations is being questioned as to whether it can be received ethically or not. In recent months, we have seen the Tate say that they will no longer accept money from the Sacklers. Also recently, both the Donmar Warehouse and the Roundhouse arts organisations in London have cut short their arrangements with Sackler and have said they don't want to receive the money that is still due to them, again on the grounds of ethics. BP is a similar case. Clearly, the climate crisis is on the top of the news agenda at the moment. We're seeing Extinction Rebellion very active, and the fossil fuel companies are under extreme scrutiny. BP have always been a big supplier of money to the arts. They've been associated with the likes of Scottish National Galleries, the British Museum, and many other organisations. They again are suddenly seeing their donations returned. Only today, the Scottish National Galleries have said that they will no longer work with BP, as have the National Portrait Gallery. We've also seen major campaigns against them. There was an occupation of the British Museum in protest to their BP associations, and you may have seen in the National Portrait Gallery naked protesters covering themselves in an oil-like substance in the middle of the gallery. So what does this say for arts organisations? Well, quite clearly it's important to have ethics around where you receive your money from. But there is a finite number of people willing to throw vast amounts of money at organisations, and capitalism is generally a relatively grubby business, and anybody that's got serious amounts of money to throw out is probably got some skeletons somewhere in the cupboard. So the question we then ask ourselves is, what's the ethical line that needs to be drawn? Do you have to look into every organisation that funds you in forensic detail and throw away the money if there is any kind of hint of impropriety? Or do you have to deal with a slightly more liberal line if you're actually ever going to receive any money again? With so much of arts funding relying on this type of money, this might well present an existential problem for the sector. What's going to happen next remains to be seen. Perhaps others will step into the breach and the funding will continue as normal, or perhaps those other two levels of funding, the public money and the self-generated income, are going to have to take a bigger part. What's certain is that if you look at any organisation, it's really worth looking into how it's funded, how it's organised, how the different parts of the tension work, because you'll probably find some really fascinating insights, and that will help you understand not only those organisations, but organisations in general. Everything is always going to be a fine balance. Move one part, other parts have to move as well. So keep an eye on that and keep thinking about your commercial awareness day in, day out.